Hello students, this is the time to speak in greater detail about two important steps. The first is review of literature and the second is generating hypothesis or formulating hypothesis. So review of literature and hypothesis buildings are very important issues in course of communication research. As I said in my last lecture, review of literature is done primarily for two purposes. Two important reasons are behind this. First is that it enhances, it broadens our mind, it broadens our knowledge over the issues under investigation. If we are interested in studying the problem faced by the migrants workers from the cities to the rural areas after the great lockdown, we need to go for proper review of literature, because if we read about it, we'll have data and other information, so it will enhance our knowledge, number one. And the second important, and that is more crucial, is the fact that review of literature helps us in formulating hypothesis. Once it enhances your knowledge over the subject, there might emerge some kind of a hypothetical propositions. Therefore, these two issues are important, and since these two issues are related, I decided to club these issues together and discuss this in this present class. Therefore, in what follows, you will see, these two steps in greater detail. Review of literature, in fact, is the critical evaluation of already published articles, books on the issues under investigation. Suppose we are doing a research on the reasons behind farmer suicide in Maharashtra and particularly Vidarbha region. We must go through the existing literature on this issue. You see, the books like the written work of P. Sainath, and similarly a couple of other scholars, and a large number of articles published on farmer suicide in Maharashtra and outside. Apart from that, we also consult the different sources of data or other relevant material. If there are some works, reports, which are not published but available in the form of mimeograph or unpublished report, we should also read it. So this is what review of literature, this is called review of literature. Because the purpose is to make ourselves aware of the issues and different dimensions of the problem. So the basic purpose is, as I said earlier or now, I would like to repeat it again, to improve our knowledge on the subject, because we do this review of literature because it helps us in the formulation of hypothesis, which is the very important issue in the entire research activity. Now coming over to hypothesis, but before going into the detail of hypothesis, I would like to make one point very clear. I have dealt with review of literature in this talk very briefly, and I have done this because in my last lecture we had discussed about review of literature in greater details. The second thing I would like to make it clear in the beginning is about hypothesis, and this is that this section, the PPT particularly, will see a number of complete sentences. This is unlike the expectation of PPT. PPT basically is supposed to have only smaller indicative words so that you could just write those words and explain verbally. But I have done this thing. I have changed. This entire report slightly, because I know the need of the students, and particularly a subject like hypothesis is very sensitive, and sometimes complete sentences are required. For example, if I want to explain the concept of hypothesis, I cannot do it without giving a simple definition of hypothesis. This is because unless until we put a definition of hypothesis in the beginning, we cannot make out distinct features of hypothesis, and that is important. Therefore, let's be very clear. The concept as I have written it myself, that hypothesis is a tentative statement, assumption or presumption regarding cause and effect relationship between two phenomena that needs to be tested. This is the definition, the complete definition of hypothesis. And whenever you are asked to write a definition, or you are asked to define hypothesis, you should write like this. You should never miss any of the point mentioned in this definition. I have written this definition because of the reason given below. Because there are three distinct features of hypothesis, and these are given below. The first is that it is merely an assumption. You assume simply. It is a tentative statement. This may be wrong, this may be right. I don't know unless and until we go to the field. So this is an assumption, and it is a tentative nature. This is the first aspect of hypothesis. The second aspect is this assumption is regarding causal relationship between two phenomena. Say, for example, A and B. What kind of relationship? Causal means cause and effect relation between A and B. A is producing B, or B is the effect of A. A is the cause and B is the A is the reason, B is the cause effect. So this is called causal relationship. And the third is that this relationship, whether this statement, this presumption is correct or not, whether this relationship actually exists or it does not, this needs to be tested in the field on the basis of data generated from the field. So this is the complete definition, and therefore please keep this in mind. Students, mind it, that whenever you are writing the definition of hypothesis, you write in your word. You are not supposed to present the definition given here as it is. You write in your language, but must not forget to mention these three features of hypothesis, these three dimensions of hypothesis. That is, it is a tentative assumption, that this assumption is regarding cause and effect relations between two phenomena. That third, it needs to be testified. If you miss any point, if you don't mention that it needs to be testified, you will not get complete marks. So this is important, and therefore I had given the definition as it is of hypothesis, and in order to make this point very clear. Now, as I said earlier, the hypothetical assumption may be wrong, and that is not going to make any difference. For example, these are the examples of hypothesis. Massive reverse migration following lockdown may emerge a source of social tension in rural India. Here in this sentence, social tension is an effect. And massive reverse migration, the migrant workers from the cities all over the country to the rural area, this is, according to the sentence, is the cause. So there is a tentative statement regarding cause and effect relationship in this. And this, as I said, this needs to be tested. Similarly, another example is education promotes employment. Employment is the effect and education is the cause. these two phenomena, education and employment. Then the third example is poverty and farmer stress are the chief cause of farmer suicide in India. If there are cases of suicide, the reasons behind such kind of suicides are poverty and farmer stress. Now, moving over to the another issues at hand so far as hypothesis is concerned. As I said, and I would repeat again, and this will be repeated time and again, that the above these hypothetical statements may and may not be true in all the circumstances. Therefore, it needs to be tested, and only empirically verified hypothesis is relevant. Once it is rejected, it remains assumption. But the moment any seriously designed hypothesis and tested in the field is tested positively, if its empirical validity stands true, means its movement is towards theory. It is going nearer to the theory. So this is very important point. The moment it is rejected, it goes back to the level of assumption. The moment it is testified, rectified positively that it is true, yes, of course, that if there is education, there is employment. If there is, wherever there are, migrant workers who have come from the cities and there are tension, it means, yes, this is working as the cause of the social tension in the rural area. So, in all these circumstances, wherever this tentative assumption is testified, and it is proved that these statements are not incorrect, it means its movement is towards theory building, that we understand that in most of the cases, wherever there are such type of phenomena, wherever there are education, there are likelihood of greater employment, or wherever there are movement of migrant workers or workers from outside on larger scale, there are likelihood of social tension. So this is the purpose of hypothesis, and this kind of research and understanding will go on. One more important thing about hypothesis is called the types of hypothesis. You see, you may call it types, you may call it stages of hypothesis, or you can give some other name. But 2-3 things we should keep this in mind. Whenever we start formulating hypothesis, there is a stage that is called preliminary stage, and then there emerges a preliminary hypothesis. For example, when we think of education, that why should we send our children to the schools? Why should provide them higher education? Why should they should be given technical education? Precisely because we are looking for their job, their employment. I mean, the students coming to JIMMC in our college, whenever they approach us, the first question they ask my students, sir, what are the possibility of getting jobs after doing courses from JIMMC? So we have to answer them. We have to satisfy them. Then only they get admission. So that is the first requirement. So therefore, what I am trying to say that education promotes employment. This emerges as the primary hypothesis. But in course of review of literature, as I said earlier, once we read different kind of source materials, published or maybe even sometimes unpublished, or we talk to somebody, then we realize that no, education of course promotes employment, but it is technical education which is likely to promote more employment, because we come across examples, or we come across circumstances where technical education is being proved more effective in getting one employment. So we make a change in our hypothetical statement, in our hypothetical, assumption that technical education is likely to promote more employment. So there is a development, there is a progress from preliminary stage to the scientific stage. So we move from preliminary hypothesis stage to scientific hypothesis. The first was the example of preliminary hypothesis, and the second is the stage of scientific hypothesis. So when we go to the field, we test this assumption, not the earlier one. We test which one? We test technical education is likely to promote more employment. So therefore, when we have this kind of a scientific hypothesis before us, accordingly we design our research design. Then accordingly we look for technique for data collection. We look for type of designing of questionnaire. We accordingly formulate our questions so that we could focus on this aspect, whether the students, those who have been students of technical education, are getting job or not. And there would be a change of our respondents as well. There would be two sets of respondents. We'll have students who have ordinary education background, and those who have technical education, those who are engineers, doctors, or some other technical education. And then we find in which sector there are greater chances of employment. Who are the people who are getting job earlier, and where is the more number of people who have got employment, in this section or the technical section. So this is the approach. Then the third is a null hypothesis. First is preliminary hypothesis, the second is scientific hypothesis, and the third is null hypothesis. Null hypothesis is basically used in the area of statistics, and they are also in statistics. The purpose is merely comparison. And what happens that we develop two hypotheses, a parallel hypothesis we develop, formulate. The first is a null hypothesis called A does not produce P. Means technical education is not likely to promote employment. And opposite this, there is an alternative hypothesis that A produces B. Means technical education is promoting employment. And then separately we test it. And whichever hypothesis comes true, which is accepted as a scientific hypothesis. These are the three stages of hypothesis or types of hypothesis: preliminary hypothesis, scientific hypothesis, and null hypothesis. I hope my students will understand the technical differences between these three, and they will keep this in mind. Then the next thing is there is a difference between proposition and hypothesis. Proposition is nothing but a kind of a generalized statement that speaks of a relationship among variables. For example, if I say that if everything goes well, the country, India, will have a double-digit growth next year. We are facing lots of problems right now. But if there is a statement that if everything goes well, if there is no coronavirus, if it is we get rid of it, and then everything comes to normal. So if everything goes well, maybe next year, that is after a year, we'll attain the double-digit growth again next year. So this is one statement. In this, in producing double-digit growth next year, there are several factors. Means there all kind of activities is there. There is no one-to-one relationship. So this is a kind of a proposition that is generalized and that is very common. But hypothesis is different from this. Hypothesis is a tentative statement about a specific cause and effect relationship. The proposition is a generalized statement, but hypothesis is a tentative statement about a specific cause and effect relationship between the two phenomena that needs to be verified. So this is the difference between proposition and hypothesis. There is a difference between hypothesis and theory. What is that difference? And this is very important, and the students should always keep this in mind, because this question is sometimes asked in the exams also. So what is the difference between hypothesis and theory? Hypothesis, as I said earlier, is if hypothesis is corrected, its movement is towards theory. And if the same hypothesis, if it is rectified time and again, and it is whenever we go for a test, we find that if there is education, there is a technical education, there is employment. So we come to a conclusion that no, that is taken for granted. That wherever wherever there is technical education, there has to be employment, and therefore technical education promotes employment. So this would attain the status of a theory. And it would be as good as saying that if there is a smoke, there is fire. Or all men are mortal, Ram is man, therefore Ram is mortal. So these are the examples of theory. What are the examples of theory? There is a smoke. If there is a smoke, there is fire. So whenever we see smoke, we assume that there has to fire, because smoke is accepted as a effect of fire. Similarly, we understand, since Ram is a man, he has to die unless until he is God. So this is theory. And similarly, in the case of hypothesis, we see that if there is technical education, there has to be employment. So this is the difference between hypothesis and theory, and the relationship between hypothesis and theory. So there is not much of a difference. Once the hypothesis is corrected, its movement, it goes closer to theory. Because it helps in selection, hypothesis. Why hypothesis has been called the foundation of research? Because it helps in our research activity, entire research activities. Once you formulate a scientific hypothesis, which is good hypothesis, it will appropriately do good research. It helps in the selection of appropriate or better research method. If there is good hypothesis, there would be good selection of research method. If there is better hypothesis formulation, there would be the selection, there would be better selection of techniques for data collection. Means thereby that will help us in a better data collection selections techniques. Similarly, if the hypothesis is better, good, the data analysis techniques will also be, the selection will be better. And in short, or in fact, lastly, and that is more important, that in fact it commands the entire research activity. So this is the importance of an hypothesis, and that is precisely, it has been given this title, that it is the foundation of the research activities. And the conclusion is, and it is very simple, and this would be a kind of a repeat once more, that since review of literature helps in the formulation of hypothesis, serious literature review is likely to formulate better hypothesis or research design. And since these two are closely related, therefore, the coming together of these two, review of literature and hypothesis, are likely to produce more scientifically valid conclusion. That is what is required. Thank you so much.